we shall proceed with our beginning of our present series that has to do really, to a major extent, I hope, with the God image of the Gnostics. Now the word God image, imago Dei in Latin, which is taken from earlier medieval literature, is a favorite expression in Jungian psychology, and thereby is really indicated the psychological circumstance. I hope that my voice is all right. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the psychological circumstance that there is an innate affinity toward, and an innate sort of borderline realization in all human beings of a superior consciousness that in most places in the monotheistic cultures has been called God. But that this borderline realization in turn needs to become more precise, more concrete, and as such the image forming capacity of the human psyche then steps in and creates an image. And by image we mean in this case not a picture as much as what the Latin imago really describes, a whole concatenation of qualities, both visible and invisible, perhaps even audible, certainly to some extent comprehensible, a compendium of descriptive qualities that whereby an ordinarily nondescript reality can be approached. And in this case, we are dealing with the manner in which human beings throughout history have approached and described sometimes their vision of their approach to the transcendental reality, which, at least in the monotheistic language, is frequently referred to as God. So the God image is an image that is formed by you of a reality that exists perhaps inside of you, but also outside of you. So when you form a realized conceptuality of this mysterious subject, then you have a God image. And that is what Jung called it. Now the reason I bring up Jung is because I always bring up Jung, given the slightest opportunity. But in this case, because my impetus in this particular case, also my impetus for various occasional short statements before, has been a particular incident in Jung's career, which was brought to my attention I will not even tell you where, but under very peculiar circumstances, when which concerned Jung's communication to one of the two gentlemen who founded Alcoholics Anonymous, and for some reason I was in the company of someone, I don't think I have seen him since, who had a Xerox copy of that very letter. It was written by Jung in English in which he told one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous that there was something very important missing in the theoretical foundations of this organization, and that was the reference to and the relationship with what he called a higher power. And that impressed me considerably, but also impressed me that a couple of hours later in the same meeting that I went to, I had a chance to kiss the hand of President Reagan's wife, very slender, very little lady with very thin hands but very beautiful hands. And so there were some interesting people there which added to the occasion. But let us say what Jung was, of course, writing about in that letter was that unless there is a conceptual and perhaps at times even partially visible imagination, what in olden times we called imaginatio, of this higher power, this superior power, an effort that involves the human psyche to a major extent will be largely futile. That a God image is a necessary factor in insight and transformative movement of the human soul. If that God image is not somehow present, then the entire effort is, as the poet would put it, so much sound and fury signifying nothing, which I believe is Shakespeare, if I'm not mistaken. So this element has to be present in any kind of an effort which is designed to expand and illuminate the human psyche and to aid it in its transformation so that it will be less inclined to resort to the kind of agencies that alcohol, for instance, represents in large quantities and which are deleterious to the human psyche and the human organism itself. So Jung then definitely put forth, you have to have what might be called a God image in this picture of how to proceed away from addiction toward spiritual and intellectual growth and transformation, how to become a real human being. If the God image is not there, then the effort is deficient and becomes consequently frequently futile. All right, now that is sort of the impetus for coming back to this subject again. But combined with that impetus is another which is of a more negative nature, and that is the fact that the presence of such a God image, and consequently the ability of large numbers of people in our culture to relate to greater realities and to be able to follow a path of positive transformation are greatly, greatly diminished because the culture no longer seems to offer much of a contact with or insight into a workable God image, a God image which will help the individual to accomplish these important tasks. And that deficiency is, of course, a very fateful one, a very difficult one. Sometime after that particular encounter, and I always like to see something by Jung, of Jung's writing in that letter, I also came across, I think, in a journal of religious studies, for quite a number of years I was teaching at a college level religious studies myself, so it's a subject that even aside from my personal inclinations has always been very important to me. And this was about the religious in fact, it was in the journal called Religious Studies in the USA, and only a few years ago. And in it, in a number of points, our present predicament in this regard has been aptly summarized. And I will recount this to you, and then perhaps have an opportunity to comment on them at greater length. That one of the great problems that the instructor in religious studies, such as one I had been myself, encounters these days is that there are no basic sources for the study of religion that are readily available, not even sacred scriptures. What is meant by this is, of course, not that very diligent searching and research of what substitutes now for the glorious reality of the libraries in the past, namely the little magic square, that funny little thing that people carry around with them. They take pictures with it, and they do all kinds of weird things with it. But in any event, it is, let us say, the information regarding religious matters and the sources of religious matters, not even sacred scriptures of the various religions, are readily available, which of course is a great difficulty. That there is also and that one is a little bit more difficult to explain. The second point that I mentioned was that there is a narrowing of focus in the interest of the people in our culture, and that this narrowing of the focus minimizes or excludes the subject of religion. So the focus of our consciousness has changed to such an extent that it no longer includes religious subjects. The third point mentioned was, and that is probably more forthright than the others, that God, this is how it was mentioned, that God is gone, primarily the monotheistic God. That the common consciousness does not relate itself to the image or the reality that previously was attributed to the deity, and that therefore you can't really include God very well into a program of studies of religions. The fourth point which I certainly heard mentioned several times, although I never truly discerned its meaning in any kind of profound manner, is that people consider themselves not religious but spiritual. And when I first encountered that, I sort of had to sit down, because I said, all right, well, what's the difference, you know? And the only thing I could come up with, that the formal allegiance to a religious tradition has gone out of fashion, but that people still consider themselves by their own definition as spiritual, meaning that they feel that they can relate to what they call spiritual things, but they try to do so without the particular form that such relating has taken throughout the ages. And probably as a result of all of this, the fifth point, that religion is not interesting anymore, because people have lost interest in religion or in God. Now, that is a fairly forthright statement, and probably quite descriptive of many conditions in our culture, and as such perhaps sums up the difficulties of this situation even more powerfully than some of the others. Now, as I occasionally mention, because I like to flaunt my knowledge of Latin around quite a bit, having had to sit through for 8 years to Latin class, I'm trying to sort of get a little payback from all of that. So let us say I have, that being the case, I remember a quotation which I think is a biblical quotation from one of the prophetic scriptures of the Old Testament, and which declares Dixit incipiens in corde suo non est Deus. The fool saith in his heart, there is no God. The fool saith in his heart, there is no God. And you got to remember that in ancient times, the seat of consciousness, we might call it, was always regarded as being in the heart. Not in the brain, but in the heart. That in itself should tell us something about the curious developments, mental developments of our culture, that we have come to assume that this little pumpkin here that sits on our neck, you know, and its contents, that these are somehow the most important thing about us. Well, obviously, if it's cut off, we are no longer very functional, shall we say. But that doesn't mean that the notion that our consciousness, our knowingness originates purely or primarily in the brain and in the nervous system is therefore a tenable proposition. That is probably not true. And so we need to keep in mind that what really religion is. This would be sort of the subject of the first class in a religion class. You know, religio in Latin means to join back or to join together. It's the same verb from which you get ligament, something that joins. And so let's say the purpose of religion as envisioned by people for a very, very long time in history was that of doing the kind of activity and study, both mental and physical or any other kind, that would establish or perhaps even re-establish a connection of the human personality with something greater, something that in the various religious traditions has frequently been called God, or the gods in the plural. And this, I think, is certainly an important matter. So now we need to keep in mind that apparently what we are facing is a deprivation of major import and of potentially disastrous consequences in the culture. And that is the deprivation of the ability and the motivation toward recognizing and making contact with that mysterious something that in earlier times we were trying to reconnect with ourselves, and thereby leaving a big psychological hiatus, a big psychological hole in our own psyches and in our own natures. And certainly in depth psychological study, which has of course been my avocation, let us say, I never practiced it professionally, and depth psychological study, which is the psychology that was first enunciated by Jung, the religious element and the willingness and the ability of the human personality to relate itself to a greater reality, to a greater non-physical reality, is of very, very great importance. So if indeed these contentions are correct, that the divine element, the transcendental element, the one that the transcendent function of analytical psychology addresses itself to, that these are being put out of the picture, no longer considered. This is undoubtedly a phenomenon that brings about a radical deprivation of a deep psychological nature in the individual. And that is what is really meant, that the fool saith in his heart, there is no God. In other words, that this deprivation brings about a hiatus in the human psyche, creates a big hole in the human psyche, which then has deleterious effects on the life of the individual. When thinking over these matters, a part of a sentence by Friedrich von Schiller, the great German poet, came to my mind. As many of you know, I am very fond of the German language, and I grew up with two languages, bilingual, Hungarian and German, and to this day I am very, very fond of German literature. And Schiller has many beautiful ballads. One of them is called the Graf von Habsburg, the Count of Habsburg, which is about the ancestor, the first member of the Habsburg dynasty, who was a little nobleman, a little count in history in Switzerland, but who was elected by the elector princes to become emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and founded the Habsburg dynasty who remained the Holy Roman emperors clear until the time of Napoleon, because Napoleon wanted to be the only emperor. See, they don't need any other emperors around here. But let us say in the very first verses of that ballad, the statement is made that the terrible, die emperorless time, die schreckliche, die kaiserlose Zeit in German, has come to an end when they elected Rudolf I emperor. Die schreckliche, die kaiserlose Zeit, the terrible, the emperorless time. So it occurs to me that this could be a little bit changed onto this more metaphysical situation, that the terrible and godless time has come upon us, and that undoubtedly also is very, very likely to be terrible. And why? Because there, as Jung has pointed out, there is a well, we might even just call it a divinity, a divine representation, a little God inside of each and every one of us. And that is the deepest center of our consciousness. That is the center of our consciousness that really knows. That is the one with which we obtain Gnosis. So the deeper form of knowledge, knowledge that addresses itself primarily to a very, very important thing, namely meaning in a very profound manner, that knowledge is vanishing from our culture. And that is definitely a very difficult situation. Now, Alan Watts, whom I was very fond of and had a little bit of personal contact with earlier on, once said, in one of his lectures when I was present, he said that every sane group of people, every sane culture in the history of the world, from the very beginning of the world's history, of which we have very little knowledge, was dominated, completely, overwhelmingly dominated by religion. He said the human being is what again we might call in Latin a homo religiosus. Without a religious connection, without an ability to somehow connect with a greater and non-material reality, the human being is unhappy and ceases to exist. This ability to relate to such a greater reality which transcends everything physical, which transcends even everything emotional, is a very important characteristic of the human being. The human being is able to relate itself to a greater reality, a transcendental reality, a divinity. And so, of course, one need not agree with Alan Watts, and I'm sure he would not demand that, but I would say that there, as well as in many other important regards, he was right. I have lived for years in a country where the culture has been dominated, has been repressed and suppressed from the top down, and a large portion of that repression having been the repression of religion. Religion was out, as it is out in all the Soviet and communist countries, including at the present time the giant of Red China and others. And let me tell you that after the struggle is over and people sort of give in to this anti-religiosity or non-religiosity, their lives are incredibly impoverished. Somehow the presence in consciousness of a relationship with something greater, with what Jung called there the higher power, is a vital requirement of the human psyche. And when it is taken away in whichever fashion, then we are beginning to suffer from what the medical profession calls a deficiency disease. And what's a deficiency? For instance, when you are deficient in vitamin C, you get sick because of something that you don't have. At other times you get sick of something that you have in you. But in this case it is the absence of a particular substance that makes you sick. And that is why, a very important historical circumstance. You know how the British came to be called Limeys? Just because of that. Because the British Navy and generally the British navigation discovered that when the sailors were out on the ocean for long periods of time, that they got these deficiency diseases, scurvy and so forth. And so what did they do? They distributed large quantities of limes to the sailors so that they would not get that particular ailment. Now others like the Dutch, who are very clever people, they distributed something that I like. I like it more than limes, and that is sauerkraut. All of these are rich in vitamin C. So there are certain ingredients of the psyche that are helpful, that allow us to function, that keep us from getting more neurotic than we otherwise would be, whatever. And one of these is the contemplation, both in conceptual form and maybe in artistic form, of a higher reality, of a higher power. And that is why everywhere, and in Alan Watts is utterly correct, in every part of the world, in every nook and cranny of history, something that we could call religion was always there. And therefore it is now absenting itself. Would that be somebody who drinks too much absinthe? Sorry. My mind works in strange channels, with or without higher power. But let us say it was always there. There are sort of two great varieties, you might say, of the expressions of the religious instinct, and they are let me see what was going to be. Yeah, they are pantheistic and theistic in nature, they have other natures too, which, let us say, there are the ones that recognize the divinity in their surroundings, in their creations, but then eventually also come to recognize them in some fashion within themselves. And these are both extremely important. So also another way of other couple of terms that are helpful in that respect, that there is a supernatural and a preternatural way of envisioning and of relating to the higher power. At the supernatural, we perceive the reality of the higher power as being outside of anything physical that we can recognize, including the manifestations of nature. The other, which is preternatural, which recognizing in a different form that a presence, even a conscious presence at times, in the environment, in nature itself. And what is important to remember that the supernatural and the preternatural do not exclude each other, but they complement and supplement each other. And of course, once we have a more esoteric explication of this phenomenon, then we can see how that works together. But let's say little children, remembering even at the age of 92, remembering my early childhood, I can well remember, let's say, the preternatural manifestations of this strange other reality in our garden in northern Hungary, because there were presences there, there were beings there, there were some even who knew how to communicate, who were obviously very closely connected with the environment, and yet they were quite different. That means they were not, they didn't look like a tree, they didn't look like a flower, they were a presence, non-physical presence, that dwells in the natural environment. These are the beings that were recognized already by the early shamans and various other people interested in those things throughout history, and who are then, let's say, in some cultures, like the Celtic cultures, they are regarded as spirits of nature. You know, you may have heard of the great Buddhist scholar W.Y. Evans Wentz, who was our fellow Californian, very interesting gentleman. I knew him when he was quite in his old age a little bit. And Evans Wentz became famous by writing about 5 or 6 books on Tibetan Buddhism. But in addition to that, he wrote one book that was entitled Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. That was his, believe it or not, that was his doctor's dissertation at Oxford. Now, can you imagine that in this prosaic, miserable age that we are living now, that Oxford University would give a doctorate to somebody with that kind of a dissertation? I think it's a little bit cold in here. Yeah, well, then maybe we just have to wait until it heats up the room sufficiently. Yeah. In any event, that is the preternatural and the supernatural are always present, and the human has an ability to relate to both of them, because the human nature itself has within itself elements of that sort. That is why when you, on the preternatural side, if you are communicating with the pixies and the fairies or whatever you want to call them, you are able to do that. Why? Because whether you like that expression or not, you are in part pixie yourself. In other words, we have within us a psycho-spiritual component that joins us to the preternatural world. But we also, thank God, have within us a component that is not just preternatural, but which is supernatural. And that is the one that brings into the picture, let us say, the religion. Because it is in the supernatural realm, above and beyond, although in various ways, creative ways and so forth, connected with the physical world, having a connection with the physical world but being not of it, that people have recognized the presence of and made use for their own conscious purposes of the divinities, the gods and the goddesses, and also eventually, when it came to that, the monotheistic God. Now, of course, we might say then that contrary to what appears in our culture today, the ability to relate to the preternatural and to the supernatural in an insightful, in a creative way is a very, very important thing for the human being. That if we are not able or willing to do that, we are depriving ourselves of something very valuable and very important. If you ask me why, I would say because what we are here for, if I want to be kind of very highfalutin about it, what we are here for is the acquisition of greater meaning. You might think, no, we are here for happiness, we are here for meeting nice people, we are here for making good movies in Hollywood, and so forth. Yeah, but those things are all very good, and we all have enjoyed them, and we hope that, like religion, they are not going to go away. However, the issue is that we are all deprived of something. We are all lacking something. And it is this lack, this deficiency within us that drives us on in life. And we try to find it here, we try to find it there. And the more we look for it, it seems that the less we tend to find it. So it is important, therefore, to realize that in our cognitive process, perhaps it might be useful for us to change the focus of our inquiry, change the focus of our sought-after relationship with ideas, with things, and with people. And that if we open up the focus of that cognitive relationship, then in fairly short order we are immensely enriched. But the narrower our focus in that respect, the more difficult our lives will become, because our ability to relate to those factors which might give our life greater meaning is thereby greatly decreased. So that is an important thing to remember. The gods are the carriers of meaning. These are the strange and mysterious beings which throughout all of history, from the primitive shamans of the jungle or of the wastes of Siberia, have come forth, sort of jumped out of the ground and brought meaning to people. We get far less meaning from others as we do from the preternatural and the supernatural, and that needs to be kept in mind. So now I am going to bore you with some historical theories, but some of them you will find even amusing, hopefully. So I think we'll bring them. First of all, it is, let's say, without a doubt that there were two great families of religion in the Near East and later the Far East as well. And these two were, if we want to locate them geographically and historically, they were ancient Egypt and ancient Persia, or as it also has been called, Iran. And the ancients always said, whenever this came up, that the land where the gods and the goddesses walked first, the homeland of the gods, was Egypt. Even at the time of Plato and Aristotle and the pre-Socratics and things like that, the Greeks always said that that their gods, that their divinities were closely related to those of Egypt. For instance, Plato, I think in the Timaeus, mentions that all the goddesses of the Greeks are aspects of Isis. So they regarded the Egyptian pantheon as their prototype and archetype. Now, both great religious groups, the Persian and the Egyptian, were polytheistic. They recognized many gods and many goddesses. And why was that? Because they felt that a unitary being or unitary source would only be able to do so much for you. And therefore, you require they require the matter of specialization in the divine household, which is probably not a bad idea. In any event, we know that the Egyptian deities were among others the symbolic carriers of, let's say, the supernatural carry the preternatural image. What do we mean by that? The animal forms. Horus, the hawk. Then the various other deities, each one of them had an animal form. Hermes, Thoth, the ibis bird, and so forth, so that people could look out into nature and see these various creatures there, and when they contemplated them profoundly, they discovered within the, you might say, the archetype of that animal they discovered a divine component. I have a strong notion that this has a certain amount to do with our predilection to have pets. Because once you know a little bit, about these archetypal beings, you can see that if you are taking Anubis for a walk on beach would drive, the jackal or dog-headed god and so forth. So that the natural, the beings in nature reminded the Egyptians of the great gods. And this really enlivened and deified, let's say, their entire lives. Because wherever they looked, they could see the presence and the operation of a deity. And this is of great importance. With the Greeks, it was a little different. Persians also, but all of these recognized individual deific powers which represented certain aspects of consciousness and which could be of great help and utility to humans. And so these are the two great families of religions initially, the Egyptian and the Persian. Now, as you may have recognized, the Persians were the grandfathers of the Aryan peoples in the world. Also polytheistic, they had many gods and many goddesses, and their gods were called in the ancient Avestic Persian language the Devas. And this name was inherited by their relatives, the people of India, where the gods, male gods are called Deva, and the female god is called a Devi. So the Aryan people who then moved from Persia, many of them down to India, carried this orientation, this recognition of the presence of the deities with them. And that is why in addition to later changes, the people of India still have the many gods whom they refer to as Devas. Now, in Persia, there was a change. Along came a prophet by the name of Zarathustra. And Zarathustra created a monotheistic faith of a one supreme deity called Ahura Mazda, and instituted a new religion. By the way, some of you, especially those of you who have pleasant connections with or memories with, let's say, the Blessed Sixties, will be glad to hear how, according to the traditions which the Zoroastrians themselves don't like to acknowledge, how did Zarathustra die? Zarathustra was performing a sacrifice, and in the course of which he had taken a very powerful dose of soma. Was in a totally altered state of consciousness. So his enemies could come in and kill him, and he was unable to defend himself. So there was already a little warning there. Don't get too high, you guys. Look what happened to Zarathustra, And of course, the Soma tradition with its various branches was inherited by India as well. But these were the two great families of religions initially, and what the Indo-Aryan polytheists and the Persian Aryan monotheists were still very closely related in their origins. Now then, let's see. So, what is the difference between the many gods and the one God? They are both true. They are both present, but they fulfill different purposes. So that, let us say, the polytheism that existed in Persia and then developed in India indicates to you the immensity of the manifestations, the immensity of the ways and means in which the one divine power is able to express itself. And now I was hoping to share with you some really wild, really off-putting details, but one of the problems is that I have suffered another little injury last night. I'm not doing all that well, but I think I still can mention some of these. One of them is, for instance, how do the monotheistic God image arise out of the polytheistic God image? If, for instance, all the ancestors of our religious traditions were either Persian polytheists to begin with or Egyptian polytheists to begin with, how does the monotheistic image emerge? Is it a one God or is it a many gods? Well, the issue is that it is really both. And we need to keep in mind, let's say, therefore, that the way a monotheistic religion starts is by selection. The believers, the worshippers, pick out of the existing pantheon of gods one whom they like, and they declare that one the supreme God, the real God, and the rest of them are then neglected or maybe even done away with. This is true all the way down. Now, we don't really know, which is crucial for our purposes, we don't really know in what manner the monotheistic God of the Hebrews was born. Where did old Jehovah come from? Well, good question. Next question, please. But let's say there is almost no doubt about it that it came from Egypt. And moreover, that his first great prophet who established the monotheistic religion and then carried it further, and also engaged in the virtually endless peregrinations of the Jewish people through the desert in order to find the promised land, which now various people are trying to take away from them again, that these archetypes originated in Egypt. In fact, this little, I'm full of these little, generally not very useful items of information or misinformation or disinformation, but let's say Sigmund Freud, the father of modern psychology, who was very interested in religion. You know, Sigmund Freud, in his apartment in the Berggasse in Vienna, nice big apartment, had a huge desk, and his desk was full of the statues of pagan gods, primarily Egyptians, very, very many of them. He really liked. He did not come quite to the conclusion that Jung came later on, that these deities are archetypal forms of the psyche, but he still was very interested in them. And he was very interested in the beginnings of religion, although, like his generation of intellectuals, he was not a believer. He was not a believing Jew. He didn't go to a synagogue much. But one of his early books, small book, you're not going to find it in many places. I think that it is being concealed by the admirers of Freud. They are not very proud of that book. And that the German title of that book was Ob Moses ein Ägypter war. If Moses was an Egyptian. And in this already Freud pretty much put forth the theory, although in a somewhat covert fashion, that Moses discovered an Egyptian god, and that this Egyptian god became the monotheistic god thereafter. This is certainly an interesting hypothesis. The animal form of that god that Moses probably discovered was a donkey, an ass, ezel in German, asinus in Latin, and because all the Egyptian gods had animal forms, and that where does, I mean, this is really Old Testament study, Genesis and thereabout, but where does Moses first meet God? He meets his God in the desert. He goes out into the desert, and there he meets a mysterious God. Now, it was the contention of some of the 19th century more imaginative scholars of religion, that what he met in the desert was the donkey god. And the donkey god in turn was an aspect of Seth, who is not a very nice fellow. One of the aspects of Seth is a crocodile, so I'm glad that Moses did not palaver with a crocodile too much. He might have gotten bit. But in any event, this aspect of the Egyptian god Seth may have been the prototype of the monotheistic God that then was taken out of the many gods of Egypt and made into the really important one God, the Lord our God, Adonai, the Lord. Quite possible. You know, somebody who picked up on this and in a very as he did on everything that he treated in a very exciting and wild fashion, was none other than the great modern British poet Robert Graves. And Graves, particularly one book of Graves, that if you are interested in religion in a weird way, and why be interested in any other way? That's the Gnostic way, of course, too. Then pick up Robert Graves' book, King Jesus. In King Jesus, which traces really the descent of the Hebrew God, it's very well represented that Moses was attached to this particular Egyptian god image, the animal form of which was a donkey, and that he had sort of occasional disagreements with that god. And one of them was just when they got to the, at least that's one version, when they got to the promised land, because the donkey god lured him outside and killed him. Freud even earlier indicated that his psychoanalytic judgment was that the Jews killed Moses, and that ever after they suffered the guilt of having killed their father, and that this has a great deal to do with Jewish theology. But then in the end, probably because of that or for whatever reasons, they killed Moses himself, so he could not enter the promised land. And so he dies outside of the promised land. It is in another Joshua, son of Nun, whose name is really the same as that of Jesus, Joshua. And son of Nun is a fish in Hebrew. It becomes very exciting and confusing if you know too many languages. So that, let's say, the donkey god and his servants then killed Moses. So quite interesting. Oh, and Robert Graves, of course, who in his poetic imagination can really do wonderful things, he decides that the Holy of Holies in the temple contained the statue of a golden donkey. You might also, if you want to start playing with this, and you're probably getting bored of it already, I don't blame you, one of the interesting aspects of this, how does Jesus ride into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday? What does he ride on when the children of Israel are waving the palm trees and shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David? What? A donkey. So that the donkey god's presence is somehow there, and I'm sure that now this has excited you tremendously, and that you have, when I tell this story most of the time, I can see the thoughts coming out of people. Why did I come to this talk? But in any event, what this is a poetic and highly imaginative version by Graves, the poet, of the definitely existing truth that there is a process, a mysterious process, whereby The monotheistic people, in this case, the one monotheistic people that claims to be the granddaddy of all monotheists, namely Judaism, the way they acquired their monotheism, by selection. That somehow either the donkey selected Moses or Moses selected the donkey. But somehow they got together, and this particular aspect of Seth then became probably one of the first monotheistic gods. Well, let's jump a little bit closer to this time, because we have all of this terrible activity going on in the Holy Land right now. By what curious process did the Prophet Muhammad select, or was himself selected by Allah, the monotheistic God? You see, in the ancient Arabia, in Mecca, which was a holy city for a very, very long time prior to Islam, there was a plaza, a temple plaza, and around the periphery of this plaza stood 365 statues of the gods of all the days of the year, and other gods and goddesses, quite a few. And and this I think is much more credible than Robert Graves' poetic fantasy with a donkey, which, however, I like very greatly, because I don't know, I have a kind of an asinine imagination, and I had a donkey when I was a child, and I think they are terrific animals. But in any event, among the gods and goddesses who stood in Mecca around the great stone, the stone that came from the heavens, a meteoric stone that is still there, and that is the Kaaba, the sacred Kaaba stone. They surrounded the Kaaba stone, were a couple, which of course is an archetypal pattern of really important deities, and this couple was Allah and Al-Lat. Al-Lat was the lady, and Allah was the male. And so Muhammad picked out, or was picked out, by one of the couple, by Allah, and said, I am the only God, and there is no other God beside me. And this was the beginning of Islamic monotheism. And it became practically an obsession with the Prophet. And then he said, well, what we have to do, because they still have all those gods over there, how horrible, in Mecca. We got to reconquer Mecca and do away with all those gods. But the Meccans didn't want any part of him, and they said, hey, Muhammad, go someplace else. So he went to another city, which now is known as Medina. Medina simply means the city. The Medina of the Prophet's city. And there he gathered his troops. Now, again, I'm detecting that you're probably getting really bored with this. But I'll just finish, because this is such an important image at the present time. So he gathered his troops, and eventually he had enough of them, and then he pulled out his sword, and everybody else pulled out his sword. They took Mecca, and from then on Mecca became the Prophet's holy city, and still is. All right. Now, I'm sure that you're terribly, terribly interested in that. But it's also interesting, sort of, among the original Arabian deities, there were goddesses mixed in with them. And one of them was Al-Lat, who was regarded as the wife of Allah. But this had So if you see the kind of worse than ambivalence attitude of a lot of Islam toward the feminine gender, look for the archetype. There is the archetype. They couldn't stand the idea that originally there were goddesses and that the wife of Allah was a goddess as well. So, this is now, this is definitely, this is archaeology and history. This is not Robert Graves. So, these matters are of some importance. Now, the people who never unified, except in a very mysterious kind of quasi-mystical way, never unified the polytheistic pantheon, were the Hindus. They maintained their gods and they maintained their goddesses, and they still have a great many of them. However, it also needs to be remembered that as is true of a lot of polytheistic religions, and I will move on to another segment in a minute. So take heart. I'm not going to leave you with the donkey god and with the Jews killing Moses in the desert of Moab, because he wanders out into the desert and is seen no more. Now, you can interpret that as that a flying saucer came and picked him up, or that in some other way he was translated somewhere else. But that is definitely a biblical statement. But what we have here is that with the Hindus there was always a recognition that while this is like the Hindu pantheon is like it's like a big company, a big corporation with many stockholders, with many employees, and those are all the gods and the goddesses, and they have their own particular province, the various things that they attend to. But if you find the right elevator to go up and up, then finally you end up with a invisible, intangible, supreme deity, which the name of which is Parabrahm. And Parabrahm means beyond Brahma, because then beyond that, then there is a Trinity. So those Hindus, they had it long before the Christians, namely Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu, and above them, sort of their original progenitor is Parabrahman, beyond Brahman. But a very great favorite of Madame Blavatsky because of her esoteric orientation that declares that ultimately everything comes from one source. And it's a splendid little story about the woman who approached Madame Blavatsky and asked her, why did Parabrahman create the world? She asked Madame Blavatsky. Madame Blavatsky looked at the lady, and I think this is in Leadbeater's letters. And Leadbeater is a very interesting man, great seer, but you know what? He did not like Americans. After some initial difficulties, encounters, because he had been here in Hollywood, I knew people who knew him at that time. He never came back. In any event, Leadbeater says in his notes that the lady who was harassing Blavatsky that way about Parabrahman was American. You see, it's a way they have, those Americans. In any event, so Blavatsky looked at the woman when she says, why did Parabrahman create the world? And Blavatsky looked at her and said, My dear, I surely don't know. Not so funny, but sometimes people laugh at this. In any event, so that, let's say, the supreme, a sort of a supreme power is recognized in various ways, sometimes in a veiled and oblique fashion in these polytheistic religions as well. There is sort of a recognition that the many came from the one. The many are the ways in which the one came to manifest. So you have a combination of a monotheistic and a polytheistic view. Now, the Ahura Mazda, the god of light in Persia, that one became a genuine monotheistic god, and also created a very interesting religion, which doesn't exist in Persia now anymore because the Muslims came in, and then the such Zoroastrians as there were still left all fled to India. So if you want to meet Zoroastrians or Parsis, as they are called there, which just means Persian, then you got to go to India. And we had a very, very lovely Parsi high priest gentleman who lived here for a number of years, was a big friend of Manly Hall's, and used to lecture at Philosophical Research Society. After he was here for several years, we even persuaded him thus to both to do a Zoroastrian fire ceremony for us. He was reluctant to do it because he was the only genuine Zoroastrian. It's a very hereditary priesthood. But then he did. And we had this big table on the stage at Philosophical Research Society. In the middle of it was a sort like a cauldron, a fire container, and Dusty both stood there in his white robes and his hat, and he was chanting the gathas of Zarathustra and throwing various powders into the fire. So the fire would, at the one time, the fire would come up all red, then it would come up all green, then it would come up all blue. It was really an interesting thing to see, because the fire is the sacred substance. That's why they don't cremate. Zoroastrians don't cremate people. The crematoriums of our cemeteries would be out of business if they were all Zoroastrians. In any event, so there the monotheistic religion caught on, but even there were times when they discovered another deity, like the deity Zurvan. I had even a dream about Zurvan once, when he came in a shape of a bird and then started talking. You know the Hungarians, in the ancient Hungarians, because before they became Christian, were very attached to the archetype of birds. These mystical birds would come to the shamanistic leaders and tell them what to do. Very, very important ancient method. In fact, if you want to see one of them, you can go to MacArthur Park, and you will find there, if you are able to find it, not that difficult to find, you will find there a monument. It's probably only about this tall. And this is the monument for the 1956 uprising of the Hungarians against the Russians. And the monument is a turul bird, one of the mythological birds of the ancient Hungarians. Beautiful, beautiful big thing. And usually in October, on the anniversary, this year was was celebrated just not very long time ago in October. Then the Hungarian community gathers there by the monument. It was also blessed by our great hero and martyr Cardinal Mindszenty. I heard him speak there. So that tool bird. Anyway, the bird symbolism is very important in some. But in any event, let's say now we need to keep in mind now, because otherwise you're really going to get angry with me, because I didn't only bore you with stories that you were not interested in, but I also did it for a very long time, and that's double jeopardy that one should not engage in. But in any event, let's say here were these great religions, and then a kind of hybrid offspring came out of Judaism, which was monotheistic, but not entirely. Polytheistic, but not entirely. It what became known as Christianity. And of course, the central focus of that is also an ancient Aryan motif, namely that of the avatar, the messenger of heaven, one God, one of the household of gods who comes down to earth in order to help humanity accomplish various things. And that, of course, is the figure of Jesus Christ. Incidentally, Carl Jung said that of God images in the world's religions, that is actually one of the most effective of the archetypal God images of all is the image of Christ, and that's why it maintained itself for so long. So let us say, all right, so here they were, the two great world religions really by then, the one that came from Persia and then migrated to India, at least in part, to the other one in Egypt, which was of extremely great age, thousands of years old. And you know, all right, well, what happened to them? How come that there was this change, and that a new religion, which itself became a world religion, took over? Well, for one thing, in spite of its occasional difficulties and foibles, the Christian religion managed to incorporate, and of course most Christians would be very angry to hear this, that they managed to incorporate elements, vital archetypal elements of the two great religious groups that were there before, namely the Egyptian and the Persian. So that really historical Christianity is a descendant, an heir of two of the great religions of the earlier historical period. And while of course there were always difficulties, it survived. And it created a culture, or let's say it was involved in the building of a culture, the greatness, the effectiveness, the practicality of which had never existed in the world. And that is Western culture. Western culture is Christian culture. But then we say, all right, so what happened to that Christianity? And now I will more or less inclusion try to indicate to you what happened. Well, what happened was that people became very fond of the thinking function, and they became practically, and then later on in actuality too, they really became worshippers of the thinking function of the human mind. And that came to be called the era of enlightenment. The era of enlightenment was led by the French, by people like Rousseau and Voltaire and Diderot and D'Alembert and all these people who, among other things, felt that a culture could be built or rebuilt which would be based on reason, le raison, you know. And that was the creed of the so-called era of enlightenment. Now, interestingly enough, and it's really important for us, I think, you may need to keep in mind that the founding of the United States occurred during the high flowering of the French Enlightenment, and that people, particularly Benjamin Franklin, who was a very popular man in the upper crust in France, le bon docteur Franklin, the good Dr. Franklin, and others, they were very fond of the era of the Enlightenment. But when the chips were down and they had to organize this new country, which they anticipated would have the makings of a new culture, they said, no, we are not going to go as far as the French. In other words, we are not going to have an atheistic component in the underlying philosophy of the United States. But he said, so what did they do? They had a Judeo-Christian biblical foundation for the United States in terms of its moral and theological background, and it worked rather well. So then, all right, that wasn't so terribly long ago. The American, it's called the American Revolution. I never like to call it a revolution because it was really a freedom fight rather than a revolution. Something happened, and this I'll conclude with that, but with some detail as well. What happened was the French Revolution. The results of the Enlightenment got out of hand. Bloodthirsty elements took over, and what reigned in France was the reign of terror. Now, why in France? Why should this all have come together? Well, there are historical reasons, because the Catholic Church, over a period of centuries, managed to alienate very, very crucial and important elements in French society. First of all, there was the Albigensian Crusades, which devastated a goodly portion of the country and which killed off in terrorist fashion a fantastically large number of people in what now is called the south of France. If you are still here and I haven't chased you away with this boring talk by March, in March we always, on 16th of March or its vicinity, we have the festival of the Cathar martyrs. So let's say a very important and very creative and very highly respected populace of an entire part of the country was butchered by the servants of the Catholic Church. And the French people, especially in the south of France, noted that, and they didn't forget. The other thing that happened was a little bit later, which hit the upper class, the French nobility, the French knighthood very much, which was the abolishing and also butchering of the Knights Templar. The persecution of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay and his associates, and so and the Albigensian Crusades left a terrible wound in the side of France. And what this wound amounted to was that the Catholic Church did not represent anything good anymore, and that something has to be done to get rid of Catholicism. And so the what might be called the Hermetic Enlightenment came about, the Reign of Terror came about, and of course the entire atmosphere, religious political atmosphere of Europe was upset by, but in any event, all through the 18th century, the attempt of the brains of France, of the encyclopedists the encyclopedists were people like Voltaire and Rousseau and others who wanted to write a series of books in which all the knowledge available to the human race would be contained. Now, only a Frenchman can be that arrogant. That's very, very difficult. But let's say it came about. And so the Enlightenment brought about the French Revolution. The French Revolution, in turn, we know what it brought about. It brought about a tremendous bloodshed and subsequent wars and disturbances which went on in Europe for a long, long time. But eventually, the spirit of the Enlightenment moved over and discovered something else. And this is, I know that I'm not in the best form tonight, but this is really the thrust of my story. And the thrust of my story is that out of the turmoil and the bloodshed and the confusion of the French Revolution and the coming of Napoleon and all of these, there grew a new spirit. And this new spirit is usually described in history books and so forth, particularly artistic history, as the Romantic movement. Now, if you are here tonight in a building that is owned by a movement that was born by the Romantic movement. 19th century occultism, theosophy, and its associates, the neo-Gnosticism of the 19th century is definitely and without any doubt associated with the Romantic movement. What does this mean? It means that once the blood was flowing in Paris, and I know a little bit about it because as I never ceased to point out that I had a great-great-grandfather who was there in Paris. He was Austrian, in Paris at the time of the Reign of Terror. And I read some of his diaries. He said, in the middle of Paris, you walked ankle deep in blood. That's not a very nice advertisement for the French Revolution. And there were others. The French kept coming back with this demon, which would destroy the beautiful and the nice things and shed a lot of blood. Because another terrible time was in the 1860s, after the Franco-Prussian War. That's when the French began to lose on the battlefield. First, they won everything with Napoleon. I mean, there was no way of defeating Napoleon until the very end. But now, by this time, it was a different situation. In any event, the French were beaten by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War, what else? And meanwhile, while Paris was being besieged and the French were eating rodents and things like that, which is not ordinarily part of the French cuisine, they organized another revolution. And this would have been a real horror. This was the so-called Commune. And the people who participated in the Commune or were in favor of it were called what? Les communistes. That was the beginning of communism. And it was pretty close to the era of when Marx and Engels were sitting in the British Museum concocting up their wild theories, In any event, fortunately, it was put down, and it was put down by a French general and his troops, and he was, in French pronunciation, it's called General MacMahon. He was MacMahon, and he was an ancestor of Ed McMahon of recent American television fame. Yeah, I met Mr. McMahon one time because we had some ecclesiastical dealings. His secretary was getting married, and he asked me to solemnize the marriage. And the first thing I did when I went up to Ed McMahon and said, "Well, Mr. McMahon, are you a descendant of Le Maréchal MacMahon?" "Oh, yes," he says, "I am." This was a Scottish family who had moved, in Jacobites who moved to France. So I'm sure you're dreadfully interested by that also. But the fact of the matter is that somehow with that low point, with the Commune and the communists, many of the French began to change their minds. And for one thing, there grew up a counter-movement to the rationalism of the Enlightenment era. People began to realize that what's in your head is not enough, that reason will not do it. It has to be something else. And what was the other? Noble and ennobling feeling. And the feelings were rediscovered. So it seems that the human imagination and spiritual creativity, including the arts in poetry and literature and the visual arts, were the real fulfillment of the Enlightenment. People began to discover that there is an enlightenment beyond rationalism, that reason is not enough, because using the reason, people still can do incredibly stupid things, and they can also do very evil things, as we can see right now. So there has to be something else. So what is that something else? Well, the people were there, both in England and in Germany, who cultivated that. Just a few names. Were quite early in this period of the rediscovery of the ennoblement of feeling: William Blake, Shelley, Byron. In Germany, Nicholas Lenau, Hölderlin, certainly Goethe and Schiller and numerous others. So something was reborn, and somehow sort of trailing on the trail, on the hind wheels of that movement, there was H.P. Blavatsky and esotericism. And what does that prove? It proves that the attempt to rationalize and to make scientific the theosophical or the esoteric matrix is a grave mistake. You will never get anywhere with that. But it is not a mistake to recognize that the motivating power of the spiritual life, the motivating power of the real theosophy, of the real Gnosis, are feelings. When you feel that this is true, when you feel that this is right, when you feel that this is something that you have to follow and to make a part of your life, and you yourself becoming a part of it, then you are on the right track. And once again, I'm not just whistling Dixie. I and others, quite a few whom I knew, some of them in this very house and in this very room and elsewhere. That's why we were here many years ago and are still here, because we felt that there is something that is really true, that is really authentic, that is not an intellectual or a political construct, but that has a grounding in truth of its own. And that feeling has guided us and has allowed us to do some of the things that we were able to do. Blake regarded it, the bringing back of this feeling-toned mystical insight. He regarded it as his great task in his work, Jerusalem. Here is a little quotation from there. To open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of man inwards, into the worlds of thought and into eternity, ever expanding in the bosom of God, the human imagination. Now you got it. So, from the ancient roots, and you got to remember, for instance, there was a real Egyptian revival in France in the wake of Napoleon's trip to Egypt. That's when the hieroglyphs were deciphered for the first time by Jean-François Champollion, whom Napoleon took over there. In any event, let's say a big, important term. But unfortunately, while it has done a great deal, while it produced the Blavatskys, while it produced the Eliphas Levis and others, it did not have the immense power that the secular and the rationalist forces had. So, let's say, a string of real Gnosis. So the magic of the imagination, as Blake puts it. Again, we are back to what we started with, the image. Because to the extent that we are able to form the image of something greater than we are or where we are, at least in our terrestrial form, when we can form the image of something that in its origins, in its ultimate essence, transcends everything else. That is the greatest magic. That is the magic of Eliphas Levi. That is the magic of Albertus Magnus, and others who said, we have a power within us, but it has to be fueled by our enthusiasm. Once again, a little linguistic helps. Where does the word enthusiasm come from? The Greek entheos, the God inside. So when we get hold of the God inside, when we are entheos, then we are enthusiastic. And this is, even as this was rediscovered by the artists, because of course there are the artistic movements and many others, musical and imaginative painting and everything else. When that is discovered, then something good can happen. So even as the bloodthirsty rationalist era, heralded by the French Revolution and by the Commune, and picked up by people like Marx and Engels subsequently, when that was replaced in the souls of people, then it was possible for the Eliphas Levis and Blavatsky's, people of this sort, to come forth. Because the God, the divine, has to be felt. You cannot think God. You have to feel God, if you want to use it that way. But I can assure you, as someone who has struggled with this all my life, well, at least since a very early period of my life, yes, you can contact an ineffable greatness, an unbelievable marvel, a beauty and a goodness beyond all imaginings, because you have a strange talent, a strange faculty within you. And this strange faculty is the magical imagination, the occult imagination. If you are able to move that way and create the imago of the divine, then it will appear and it will be with you and it will help you and it will inspire you. And if this happens to enough people, then the entire culture may be regenerated, may be revivified, may be made into what it is supposed to do. Even as I mentioned before, to open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of the human. This can still be done. This can still be done. And I apologize for the somewhat difficult delivery, that with my recurring accidents that make me hurt here, make me hurt there, but I assure you, whether I am 92 years old or whether I was 19 years old, I got a taste, and it's a wonderful taste. You know, we Hungarians are culinary people, and there is no taste, and as one of the Gnostic scriptures says, Prophet Mani stating, no taste like the taste of God, no taste like the taste of the supernal worlds. It is magnificence, it is life-giving, it is inspiring, and it is capable of leading us onto itself. Every time that there is the slightest contact with that ineffable greatness, there is something like a ray of light that falls down on you. And you know, that ray of light never leaves, never leaves. And not only that, but with it, when you leave this world, you will go to the source of that ray of light, which was always here, which was understood as the gods and the goddesses, which was understood subsequently in different ways, and which is still here. It is available, it is present, it can be experienced, and with God's help and with our doing, I assure you, we shall experience it. Yes, we shall experience it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.